Welcome back to Pride Matters,
Salford Pride's official podcast, giving a voice to the communities in Salford and beyond.
I'm Ricki, the head of people.
And I'm Connor, head of events.
Today we're going to be joined by Josh, the project coordinator from George House Trust.
Hayley, the assistant director of services at Albert Kennedy Trust.
And also some people who identify as bi, talking about their experiences to celebrate Bi Awareness Month.
So last month we chatted to Ben, Ewan and Aidan about activism. We had some great conversations with them, hearing their thoughts and opinions and experiences. But in this episode we're doing something a little bit different, aren't we?
That's right, we're going to be talking about health, wellbeing, sex and solidarity within the LGBT plus community. So hi Josh, welcome to Pride Matters. Thanks for joining us from George House Trust. You're a member of the services team at George House Trust. Can you tell us a little bit about what George House Trust is and how you're supporting LGBT plus people at the moment?
No, of course. Well, first of all, thanks for having me. So George House Trust was originally formed in 1985. It was initially called the Manchester AIDS Line, and it was set up by 6 volunteers, and it's called AIDS Line because it was a telephone line, and it was in, I suppose, response to the unfolding epidemic around HIV and AIDS. And so we've been around for over 30 years now, and we've kind of morphed into George House Trust over the years, and we're the second oldest HIV charity in the UK, second only to Terence Higgins Trust, which are based in London. And our role as an organisation is that we support people living with and affected by HIV in Greater Manchester, but also more widely across the Northwest as well. So I suppose we're like a local HIV charity really, and we work with people predominantly living with, although we do work with people's partners and friends and family and such. But our goal is as an organisation to ensure that people living with HIV can live long, healthy and I suppose happy lives and confident lives with HIV. So that's what we're about, I suppose, in a nutshell.
Okay.
So what are the experiences of living with HIV and what does positive living mean to you?
Well, first of all, the experiences, like with anything, the experiences will be different dependent on the community someone's from and their own lived experience. There are no two people who have the same experience of living with HIV. I suppose where there are commonalities would be around things like diagnosis, taking treatment, talking about HIV, which is something that people often find very difficult because of the stigma. I mean, there remains a lot of stigma around HIV even today, but I suppose one of the key things is how much living with HIV has changed. If you go back to sort of the 1980s and the 1990s, HIV, or what was more commonly known as an AIDS diagnosis back then, was a death sentence. So you were diagnosed and you were given, maybe a life expectancy of a few years or even less. And there were treatments such as AZT, but they were very difficult to take and they weren't that effective. But what happened in 1996 is you had what we call triple combination therapy, which is 3 drugs that effectively treats HIV. It doesn't cure it, so we've not found a cure, although there is promising research. But the treatment we have today means that someone diagnosed with HIV can expect to live a long and healthy life, or a relatively healthy life. And the life expectancy of someone diagnosed today is the same as the general population, if not actually a bit longer for certain groups, because one of the things for people living positively or living with HIV is that you are monitored very regularly, so health conditions are picked up very quickly. So a lot of people, when they're diagnosed, it's still a very traumatic, and often can be a life-changing diagnosis, but it doesn't have the same meaning that it would have done, 20, 30 years ago. We've come a long way. But where things haven't changed as much, and what I mentioned earlier, is around stigma. So there is often still a lot of stigma out there, whether that be within the LGBT community or wider society. So it can be very difficult for people, and it can be life-changing. It can knock people's confidence. It can, a lot of questions are asked, like, how am I going to talk about this? Am I going to be able to have a relationship? Do I need to tell my employer? And it's still scary because people do believe, where we are medically, a lot of people don't know about that. So when people receive a diagnosis, they'll quite often think, oh, actually, I'm going to die, or I'm going to become seriously unwell. And I suppose, in saying that as well, you do have a lot of people who have been living long term with HIV who were maybe diagnosed in the 1980s, the 1990s, who didn't start treatment straight away, or their immune system was severely damaged, and they're living with long term effects of HIV in terms of their health. So the experiences tend to be different, and the experience of say a young gay man might be completely different to a young heterosexual woman in terms of their ability to talk about it, or the response of their community. So I suppose the key thing to take from it is it's very different, and we're in a much better place than we have been previously. And new treatments are always coming out, and the prognosis is very good, but it still remains a difficult diagnosis and a difficult piece of news for people to hear, which is why we're still here, providing support, especially to people who are newly diagnosed.
So what are some other misconceptions of living with HIV, as you was talking about stigma earlier?
But you still hear surprisingly regularly around, people still are concerned that if I share a cup, I'm going to transmit HIV. And we've known that doesn't happen for years. That's something that was debunked in the 1980s. There was clarity around how it was transmitted very early on, but that hasn't necessarily filtered through to the wider public. So you still get people being concerned about using a toilet seat, or using a cup, or using cutlery. There is still those misconceptions around someone's going to get seriously unwell, or that someone is going to die. And I suppose again there are those misconceptions around who might get HIV, because often there's stigma around that in terms of what someone's done. And the sort of good and bad HIV. You saw a lot of that in sort of the 1980s, where certain people were seen as being, I suppose, having good HIV or good AIDS because they might have got it through a blood transfusion. And then you had people who were kind of in the camp of bad HIV or AIDS, where they've got it through sex. So that kind of still remains as well in terms of how people view HIV. And I think a lot of that stems from the fact that it's, for a lot of people, sexually transmitted, and there's a lot of stigma associated with that.
Yeah, I think it's one of the conditions where stigma is. I remember last year at the World AIDS Day vigil, there were a few positive people attending and talking about living positively and talking about the stigma that they face, particularly, like you say, around transmission. And I remember, I think on your website you talk about you equals you and supporting that statement. What does that mean? Like,
so the U equals U statement means undetectable equals untransmittable, and one of the advances in treatment is so when someone is diagnosed, they're generally given two counts, one of which will be the CD4, and that's a kind of marker of someone's immune system. And the CD4 cells are kind of like your immune system, your helper cells or T cells. And a healthy adult will have anywhere between 500 and 1500. What HIV does is it reduces the CD4 count, because over time it will damage those cells, and it means that you're less able to kind of fight off infections. But you also have the viral load, and the viral load is the amount of virus that's in the body. And again, that varies from person to person, from anywhere from a few thousand up to sort of 10 million. Often it'll be very high when people are sort of what we call seroconvert, when they initially convert in terms of becoming HIV positive. What the medication does, the triple combination therapy, is it brings that viral load down to below 50, or that's the aim. So if you think of a difference, if you have 10 million and 50, that's a huge difference in terms of the amount of viral load in the body. And the higher the viral load, generally, the greater the risk of transmission. So the treatment brings that viral load way down. And when they say undetectable, it's still, someone is still positive, they're still HIV positive, and it is detectable. That's kind of a phrase that's been used historically, because in the past it might not have been detected. But when it is below 50, we know conclusively that someone cannot transmit HIV in any way. There's been numerous studies that have been conducted between what we call serodiscordant couples, where one's positive and one's negative, and where they don't use condoms or other forms of safer sex practices. And there were thousands of sexual acts were, I say monitored, but they weren't watched, but in terms of that couple were monitored, and there were zero transmissions. And the first thing around that came out with the Swiss statement in 2007, where a group of Swiss scientists said that we believe that if someone's undetectable, they cannot transmit. So what's happened over the last sort of 13 years is that study after study has been done, to the point now where scientists can say conclusively that if you are undetectable, on treatment, you cannot pass the virus on. And something like over 90% of people living with HIV in the UK are undetectable, because that is the aim of all treatment. And that's a major thing in terms of living with HIV. It's a major confidence boost, because you can say to a partner or a family member that, there is no risk to you. I know that, that my virus is undetectable, it's under control, it's, I suppose, effectively being put to sleep. So we can have sex, we're knowing that there isn't that risk. So it's been a game changer, really, and it's meant that people with HIV can, I suppose, live more confidently in that knowledge. And the other side to that as well is it means that your CD4 count, so those T cell numbers, or that immune system number, that can increase as well. So you're living more healthily. So it's got the positives around not transmitting, but also the positives around ensuring that someone with HIV can live with a healthy and robust immune system as well.
In England, there's just been a rollout of relationships and sex education. Obviously, we've talked a lot about the stigma that HIV positive people face. Do you think there's a role for education in educating people about living positively and living with HIV?
Oh, definitely. I mean, how many of us had effective sexual education at school? Not many of us. I certainly didn't, especially around LGBT plus issues. It was kind of, here's a banana, put a condom on, and that's it. And here's some awful pictures around what STIs look like. There was no discussion around what HIV is, or what it's like to live with HIV, or I suppose how to form relationships that are healthy as well, and how to navigate sexual relationships and intimacy. I mean, it's something that I think for young LGBT people, you go into you start forming these relationships and you're not necessarily equipped with the skills or the confidence to navigate those, and that ultimately will probably play a part in becoming HIV positive. I myself am positive, and I was diagnosed when I was 21, and I knew about HIV. It was like the bogeyman. It was like this thing that kind of goes on, but I didn't have the confidence to kind of do anything about it. It was almost, it was a fear, but not a fear that I was actively engaging with or responding to. So when it happened, it was a complete shock. But looking back now, I'm like, oh, well, I'm not saying it's not a surprise, because loads of people won't become positive, but it's less of a surprise. And do I believe that had I had effective education, it might not have happened? Possibly. I mean, you can't really, it did happen, so there's no point looking back with hindsight 2020 vision. But I didn't really know how to talk about sex, or how to talk about safer sex and condom use, and I didn't really have the confidence or probably the self-esteem, really, to be like, actually, I want to have sex in this way, or this is what sex that I feel comfortable and safe looks like for me.
Yeah, definitely. The programme that they've put together starts, like you say, with from younger years talking about healthy relationship building, being consensual friendly, how to build good relationships, and then later builds on towards like sexual relationships, condom use, safe practices, things like that. So it looks to be a quite exciting programme, and like you say, hopefully that will tackle at least some of the stigma around sex and sexuality, and mean that young people are a bit better educated than like we were when we were growing up, hopefully.
Yeah, no, and I mean, if you think that historically, for most young LGBT people, their first experience around sex and sexuality is a gay bar. And is that always the best place to be learning about? I mean, I'm not saying it's always a bad place, but if you're throwing an 18-year-old into a space where there's loads of drink, there's loads of drugs, there's potentially, it can be quite a predatory environment, or even, if you look at the apps like Grindr and such like that, it's not necessarily the best place to be learning about this kind of thing. So to do that in school, to, start that conversation, I think can only be a good thing, really.
And just if someone is worried about that their positive status, they've had an encounter, where can someone go to find out if they're worried, if they want some more information?
So if someone is concerned, you can speak to, if you wanted to be tested, you can go to one of the Greater Manchester clinics, and there are loads, and it's on the Northern Contraception website where you can see. I think it's a bit more difficult to get a test at the minute, but they are still doing them, especially like home-based testing. I'd always say that if someone is living with HIV and struggling, is to reach out, because we often see that people are a bit reluctant, especially early on, to come to George House Trust. especially to come into the building and such. But we can support. If it's around finances or if it's around emotions, if it's around, confidence around things like having sex, it's always better to talk to people. And I know from the work that I do, I was a mentor before taking on this project, like just being able to speak to other people living with HIV can be a massive change, because, you can see that there are other people out there who are living well, and there is nothing to be ashamed of from being positive. It is a medical condition, and it is one that unfortunately disproportionately affects gay men. And it has done for years. So there's no shame in being positive, and there's no shame about talking about it either, because the stigma remains or is still there because people are scared of talking about it. So we need to dispel a lot of these myths and these misconceptions. And obviously things like pride events have a really important role to play in that, and the work that like you guys do at Salford or like Manchester or wherever. So yeah, if anyone has any questions or wants to get involved, just get in touch. We're a friendly group of people. We're always happy to help, and we're always happy to listen as well. And we will always take what people say seriously.
Yeah, great. Thank you so much for talking to us. It's great to see. It's not easy putting in the time to do these kind of things. So yeah, keep up the good work, and thank you so much for coming on chatting us today.
No worries. Well, thank you very much for having me.
So hi Hayley, thank you for joining us at Pride Matters. So can you tell us a bit about Albert Kennedy Trust and some of the work that you do with them?
Yeah, Akat is a charity that's been going for 31 or 32 years. I probably should know that, but certainly over 30 years, and it started off in Manchester. And I think it's pretty fair to say that, like with all charities, kind of the emphasis has changed slightly, but I think it very much remains as it was at the beginning around working with LGBT young people, and helping them with housing, homelessness, and kind of in quite a broad sense. It's got offices kind of currently in Manchester, Newcastle, London and Bristol. It's somewhere we've been working the last kind of 12 months as a pilot. So I think it's national, but it's not massive. We've still got, I suppose, every team, if you like, in every office responds to the needs of that city. So we see quite different themes around homelessness and LGBTQ plus issues, but I think some of the needs of them cities are very different, and the offices, I think, and the staff team that work within them kind of respond to that and kind of relate to the people that we're working with. London works with vast majority of young people in London, people of colour, whereas in Newcastle, lots of people we work with there are identify as trans, whereas in Manchester we see a bit more of a kind of broader mix.
What are some of the projects that George House Trust deliver, particularly in Manchester, because that's where we are, but in general, how do you support LGBT plus people accessing safe places?
Yeah, so we kind of do, I suppose, quite traditional casework, which is kind of signposting in people to kind of services to get housing primarily. So kind of whether that be through statutory, kind of going through the councils and getting people emergency housing under the legislation, or kind of brokering them to be able to kind of access things like private landlords, house shares. We're able to do Rainbow Starter Packs, which enables people the financial support for people to kind of make that move. So it might be kind of providing deposits, like rent up front, kind of furnishings, additional things that barriers might exist for them young people to get in accommodation.
So why is creating a safe, inclusive accommodation and education and workplace important?
I think homelessness, in a broader sense, have a much higher representation of LGBT people than the general population, and that's because of some of the routes into homelessness are often due to people's we have to leave because of their sexuality, is often a route into homelessness. And I think it's also a response to the services not being designed in a way that makes LGBT young people feel safe in them. So fear from other residents. This is specifically kind of true as well for trans young people. Kind of being put into what accommodation, often accommodation that's provided by local authorities is kind of same-sex provision. Where does someone fit into that, depending where they are in their journey and transitioning, and how their local authority interprets their gender identity and how they express themselves? It can obviously be quite a traumatic experience being put in a all male or all female hostel for a trans person, and how that's kind of navigated. So often people will become homeless because they might get offered somewhere but leave it because it just does not meet their needs and they don't feel safe there. There's obviously within the other residents it might be homophobia and transphobia and biphobia, from the other people who live there. So I think the reason for homelessness can often be due to someone's LGBT status, but actually not necessarily, but often the experience people might have in services kind of results in them becoming homeless. Private landlords that might evict, an LGBT young person more readily than they would do somebody else, particularly when we're looking at intersectional identities, like a black homeless young person in London who's LGBT, might get moved on by the police. They're not particularly probably very for private rented, lots of landlords wouldn't take that person on. So I think there's lots of different barriers to kind of getting people into housing and specialist housing. And I think particularly in Manchester, we're seeing the kind of the increase of rent kind of move, astronomically. So it's not accessible for lots of young people, and particularly not young people who might not have the family support to help them with that kind of the financial support that goes with that. And I think the way that the kind of legislation and the kind of housing and finance support is now kind of governed, if you like, it's around people under 35 being in house shares. And again, if you might be really fearful of going in a house share if you don't know if it's a safe environment for you, you're working with people you're not living with. And again, particularly for I'd say for trans young people, that is the case, that the kind of how they navigate a house share, sharing bathrooms with people that they never met before. So the kind of the rate that they would get through local housing allowance to kind of what options they've got are very limited, and it doesn't often feel a safe place.
Yeah, I know on your website you talk about, I think it's like over 24% of homeless people identify as LGBT+, and I can't remember the statistic, but quite a high percentage of those people, I think it was over 60%, said that they were homeless because of their sexual orientation or gender identity.
That's the reason why they came in. And I think there is other people who maybe didn't have that route into it, but because of their experiences through housing and their discrimination in the housing process, then end up becoming homeless. And I think it's probably fair to say that often LGBT young people kind of what I would phrase as like hidden homeless. So they might not necessarily be the people that you might think of as rough sleeping who are sat out, as you're walking around Manchester. That's kind of, an obvious issue within Manchester. It is the people that are on the buses all night that are hiding in, using like places that are open 24 hours with, nighttime economy, that they're out and they're not going to stay, but they are kind of staying out of sight of kind of the system, if you like, because there's a fear of getting into the system and kind of the negative impacts of kind of going to homeless day centres where there's some of the 70 people are accessing that for breakfast. A lot of them are entrenched rough sleepers that have got substance misuse problems, and if you're a young taking on the LGBTQ aspect of it, if you're a young person, it's such an intimidating environment to go to, so you will keep yourself away from some of them services, but then you lose routes into support as well by doing that, by kind of keeping yourself away or kind of like sleeping on sofa surfing on people's friends. You don't appear in any figures. There's not the same kind of provision for you in that way because you're not a visible nuisance, if you like, because resources often get put into things that are visible and things that people complain about. So if you're kind of staying at your friend's sofa and hopping from bed to bed every night, which is a horrible way of living, and it is homeless, but it just doesn't have the same kind of resources put into it because of the invisibility of it.
What's next for Albert Kennedy Trust, and what are you going to be up to?
So I think for Akat in Manchester, we've got a nice new office which we couldn't move into because of COVID, so we've got loads of boxes that need unpacking, but we are going to be in there in the next kind of couple of weeks. But I think the office allows us a lot more ability to kind of expand our services because of the space, and also to welcome partners in to use the space to kind of meet their young people and use it as a point of contact, because we're lucky with the size of it. As I mentioned before, we're looking at kind of at the moment in the planning stages of getting accommodation opened up in Manchester to better serve the LGBT housing is so limited in Manchester, and especially for supported housing, so looking at that. We have seen a big increase, which we don't talk to anybody, around the amount of digital work we've done. I mean, and obviously some of that is staff going online and doing Zooms and whatnot, but also around people wanting support digitally. So I think for some people, this has allowed them, particularly for people like from, who might not be out or might have kind of quite strong cultural or faith kind of backgrounds, that they can still access support from home safely and not have to come into a building where they might get kind of seen. And so I think it has allowed some people to access support that wouldn't maybe have found us. So I think we've got a new digital caseworker starting on the 19th of October. We appointed this week for that. So we're going to be able to offer much more nationally, but that's based in Manchester, and that will kind of be about, running our current digital offer, but actually how can we engage with more young people online, because lots of young people kind of really kind of get a lot out of that. So kind of in different kind of spaces that we can be in and creating them, and that speaks to kind of some stuff before about kind of them intersectionality of identity, so we can kind of offer specific a trans space on a Monday night online, and we can offer that, and it's not as resource heavy. So I think that's kind of what's happening in Manchester. Yeah.
Yeah, it's very exciting.
Sounds
We said earlier, but we started a virtual check-in like meetup called Chit Chat, which is like a peer group that, like you say, because people are so isolated, not connecting with their normal support networks, we made Salford Pride have just started our own little project of getting people together. We had one yesterday, and people just came on, like they can call in, they can come on video if they want to, and one of the people that came on, was just saying how nice it was to just have someone to talk to, and that's all the difference that matters, isn't it? If you've changed one person, that's great. Hi Polly, thanks for joining us at Pride Matters. Polly, you are a volunteer for Salford Pride. Can you tell us, what do you do for Salford Pride?
Yep, so I am the press officer. I've literally just started, so just getting involved with stuff, but yeah, super exciting.
Very exciting. And you work for the Students' Union in your day job, don't you? Is that right?
Yeah, so I work at Manchester Students' Union in marketing, but I also used to work in student campaigning before I did that, so done lots of activism stuff as well.
And Polly, just with obviously talking about bi people and how bi people still experience homophobia like lesbian and gay people do, but there are many issues that are unique to the bisexual experience. What does being bi mean to you, and how did you find your sexual orientation?
I think I've thought about this a lot recently. I don't know why, but I've done a lot of reflecting. Maybe it's lockdown. But basically, I think, a friend asked me this recently, and I think I realised from probably the age of about 10, 11, 12 that I wasn't straight and that I probably also fancied girls. And I think I never really knew what bisexuality was. I never saw it anywhere. I was never taught about it. And I think when I found that term, I was longing for a label, because there's that whole, let's not label. I think I was desperate for a label or an identity, because I always thought I was confused, and I was always very much I'm not straight, but I'm not a lesbian, and I'm what is this? And I thought growing up that I would have to pick, and then I think it was sort of when I left, because I'm from Northampton, which is okay, but I think since coming to Manchester for uni, I realised that there was sort of a whole wealth of identities that didn't have to just be sort of the lesbian gay stuff. And I sort of, even though I'd heard of bisexuality, I think Manchester maybe helped me learn about it. And then I was oh, okay, I think that's what I am. And then, yeah, I sort of settled on it. I know it sounds a bit ridiculous, but yeah, I sort of was happy to find an identity that I could be oh, I'm not just confused or whatever. So it took me quite a long time, I think, to come to terms with it, but I'm glad I have now.
Do you remember your first introduction to bisexuality, your first time you ever really understood or seen it?
If I'm honest, the first time I sort of remember seeing it, I can't remember a specific time, but I remember it was in an episode of Will and Grace. Do you remember that? And I think my mum was watching it, and I think Grace went to someone's house and there was a woman and she went and slept with the woman. And obviously I was probably a kid, so sex was a bit I remember being oh, she dates men, but now she's sleeping with a woman. So I remember that was the first time I was you could do both. But I think because I was a bit young, I was oh, that's just sex. So I think when I first really got introduced to the concept in popular culture or sort of the world, a lot of it was sex orientated, or people in films having threesomes or something like that.
I think there are many misconceptions and stigmatization. Like you say, it's often one of the sexual identities that is oversimplified to be, people think you're greedy, people sometimes think it's a stepping stone to another sexual orientation. What do you think, if anything, do you think if there was one thing that everyone could know more about being a bisexual person, what would that be?
I think it's that we exist, because I have a boyfriend. I have a long-term boyfriend, and I think from straight people, when I tell them I'm bisexual, they're oh, your boyfriend's so lucky, because I think they think I'm going to go and be let's invite loads of girls back. And then I sort of think my sort of within the LGBTQ community, I have to feel like I have to validate myself. I'm like, I've got a boyfriend, but I am bi, I promise. I promise. Like it. So I'm in it is a bit. I think the one thing is that sort of just like understanding that you can be in a relationship with, I say either gender, any gender. But if you say you're bisexual, you are bisexual. Like, I sort of feel like people question it a lot. I don't know. You sort of get the, oh, are you really?
So you were saying like people will assume you're straight. Would you say there's a lot of biphobia within the LGBT community, and not as much understanding from gay or lesbian people as there could be?
Yeah, I think so. I think I think I struggle a lot, maybe more with lesbians. I don't know why. I feel like if I'm in a group of people that identify as being lesbian, I think that's where I feel like I struggle the most to be like, I've got a boyfriend, but please accept me. That kind of thing. It's like really little things. Like I always have my nails done. And like I went on a night out with a group of lesbians and they were all lovely. But one of them was like, oh, you're so straight because look at your horrible straight nails. And they were like having a laugh. And I had to be like, but please, I'm not. And it was kind of like, it wasn't awful, but I was a bit like, I've already said I'm not. So why are you sort of making out like I am?
It outcasts you, and it, my friend is bi. She doesn't feel comfortable with going to the gay village and places like that because it's very much she doesn't feel accepted there, even though that is her community too. So that's been quite a big struggle for her, which is crazy because you would think LGBT people would have that understanding of what it feels like to be the outcast in the group.
Yeah, and I think what we sort of spoke about earlier with the sort of sexualisation of it in the media, I think because a lot of people do perceive it as if you're in a sort of straight couple, if you say you're bi, I think people in the LGBTQ community and straight community I think people assume that you're like going to sleep with women. Do you know what I mean? I think that is embedded a little bit in that LGBTQ community as well, where they think because you're in that sort of area, that space, and you've got a boyfriend, there's maybe the assumption that you're like, I don't know how to word it. Like I think people think you're like fetishizing sleeping with women for your boyfriend's desire. Whereas it's kind of like, I'm not trying to sleep with anyone. I'm quite happy. I'm just trying to be part of a community. But I think because that is so embedded in all sort of conceptions of bisexuality, it definitely feeds into the LGBT community as well.
Before we say goodbye, I guess, how do you think people can be a better ally for bi people, by their bi friends? How can the LGBT community, but also people who are not that aware, support you?
Yeah, I think the basics of educating yourselves, listening to podcasts like this, or there's loads. I do think social media's gotten a lot better with educating people. There's a lot out there, and I think a massive thing is calling out biphobia. I think I personally don't get offended by it. I just sort of eye roll and just think, of course, this comment's been said again. And then when that happens a lot, you feel, it's when it happens a lot that it gets you down, especially in LGBTQ spaces. So I think especially if you're in a space like that and you see it, comments that are sort of sexualized or, sort of just things we spoke about earlier, just call it out and be like, come on. Like, we're all part of like a community. We shouldn't be sort of treating each other like that. Definitely.
Exactly. We have to remember that, when you hear homophobia, when you hear biphobia, transphobia, you need to challenge that. You need to question where those voices are coming from, because if you're in a safe space and if you're in a position of privilege like I am as a white man, I need to use that privilege to challenge people and to try and protect my friends who are less vulnerable and don't have the voice or the position to say that's not right.
And I think a lot of the time people can mean harm, but I think a lot of the time people just think they're being funny. So it's kind of that thing of like, come on, that's not...
Definitely. Thank you so much, Polly, for coming on and spending a few minutes chatting about you and your experiences as living as a bi person. It's been really interesting, so thank you very much.
Yeah, great, thank you so much.
Thanks for having me.
Hopefully see you soon when all this lockdown is
over.
Eventually.
Definitely.
So hi Heather, welcome to Pride Matters. Thank you so much for joining us today.
It's great to be with you, and happy Pride, everyone in Salford.
Yeah, well, we celebrated our own Pride back in June, but we've just had Manchester Pride virtual alternative weekend, which was a nice, different way of celebrating Pride in a social distanced way. September marks Bisexual Awareness Month. Heather, can you just tell me first a little bit about you, how you identify?
Yeah, I'm a trans woman who's bisexual, and I'm actually pansexual. So to people in the LGBT society, in the LGBT world or LGBT plus world, I say I'm pansexual. To people who are not really aware of sort of like all the labels, I will say I'm bisexual, because I think sometimes it gets a bit confusing for people who want to be understanding about LGBT plus identities. But if you say so many, then they find it confusing. Basically pansexual is I'm attracted to people regardless of their gender. So that can be male, female, it can be transgender if people define as, a third gender or non-binary. So, how I found that out about myself was a very strange and interesting sort of like tale. So because I'm transgender, I was growing up in the era of Section 28, there was no information about being transgender or what that meant, or discussing being bisexual or anything. Although I'm quite bright, I wasn't necessarily very aware of, different sexualities, etc. And I thought, I'm attracted to men because actually I'm a woman. Okay, so inside my head, I'm a woman, so that's why I'm attracted to men. And I'm attracted to women because actually I'm physically male. So, I'd never heard of bisexual, and I assumed it was all to do with me being trans. And then as soon as I went to university and I met some other people, I was explaining this to them, and they went to me, Heather, that is bisexual. And it was oh, yeah, of course it is, etc. But I suppose that the trouble was that, as I said, Section 28, there wasn't really that knowledge there. I couldn't really ask my parents, or wasn't really out to my parents. It was a time of more homophobia, and although my parents meant well, they weren't, switched on about things either. So it's really only going to university that I found out. And maybe there's more information out there now. We've got the internet is more accessible to everyone, but at the same time, there's lots of misinformation and a lot of abuse out there and everything else. So, it must be a bit of a minefield to find out things about yourself when you're growing up. And I suppose the final thing was, happily defining myself as bisexual for a very long period of time. And then I met someone who was non-binary, and it was actually yes, just, bi meaning two is just is not the appropriate label in that context. So, I got introduced to the concept of being pansexual. I don't think there's anything wrong with the label bi. I think it's a very positive label. But I think also at the same time, it's good within the community to recognise there are more than more than two genders. So hence why I talk about being pan in the community. And
quite a lot of the straight community, the people who aren't as well educated in LGBT plus issues. I remember one person speaking to me about pansexuality, and I was explaining it's about loving the person regardless of their gender, because like you said, the term bi implies there's two, and if you're advocating that there's more than two genders, then it's very hard to try and explain all of those terms that are associated with gender, like trans, non-binary, to someone that isn't as well educated on LGBT plus issues.
Yeah, no, I agree. So, and as I say, apart from the transphobes and the LGBT plus phobes, etc. Most people are understanding and want to know, etc. But it is easier to use the general umbrella term of bi outside, and then pan to the people that really want to know a bit more about things, etc.
So, what do you think that the misconceptions are about being a pansexual person? Like, what do people instantly assume that is, or misunderstand from that?
Well, I suppose it's a bit like bisexual labels. You know, people assume that you're greedy, or they don't understand what pan means, and think you're attracted to saucepans or something, you know, silly like that. Sort of. I mean, you know, you get lots of different things. I mean, but most people are, you know, it's like everything. We don't educate people enough about difference, and you know, so if it's outside the norm in terms of what people come across, then, you know, there's lots of different assumptions, and, you know, I don't know, sort of like, yeah, you just get a lot of diverse views, or you get, you know, down the track about gender and, you know, gender identities, and whether people are attracted to what they perceive your gender is, or what your actual gender is, and all that complexity. But as I say, within the communities, there's not really that much problems, and, you know, it's people of understanding, really. So, you know, and let's face it now. I mean, when I was growing up, sort of like I'm just going to sound like an old person now. It was there was very few people out as non-binary. So, you know, and I suppose there might be many reasons for that. Partly it's an issue of sort of like there wasn't the knowledge there for people to be able to identify as non-binary. So a lot of people would say they're trans, and maybe sort of like now, if they were in the same position, they'd say they're non-binary. But hopefully, because, you know, it's far more common, far more known about, and you know, accepted, people will you know, realise that bi is limited. Like all labels are limited, but sort of like, you know, nevertheless, they're useful, but bi is a bit of a limited label on that score. So, yeah.
I think that's the problem. We were just talking with our last guest about, you know, when you're finding your sexual orientation, when you're on that journey, you do seek out labels, but that's because I think labels are just a shorthand way of saying this is who I am, this is who I love. But also, you know, by choosing that one word, you do somewhat restrict yourself to the misconceptions and what people perceive to be that label. I know lots of, you know, I know lots of gay women who say they're gay rather than lesbian because, you know, the fetishization that happens with the lesbian community. And like you say, you know, a lot of bi people choose to go with pansexual because, like you say, there's more than just two genders. So labels can be very reductive, but I think it's good that they're there as a bit of a shorthand way of, so you can say to people, this is who I love, this is...
Yeah, I mean, I think it's like everything. So like, if you're taught at school about things, okay, and you start to, I mean, you know, parents are often educated by their children, strangely enough, okay, so like the parents are way behind on sort of like the social trends or whatever else, and, you know, if you've got kids or grandchildren or sort of like, you know, friends, children, etc., they often teach you things that you don't know. But I mean, let's face it, prejudice is taught. It's not inherent like that. So, you know, it's really important. And, you know, some people come from, you know, backgrounds where their family is LGBT plus phobic, etc. So actually having those outlets at school to teach people that it's okay to be who you are, and there are resources out there to find out about things, I think is really important. But it can't stop at, you know, at school. It's got to be something that is out there in general. And, you know, the question is, what type of resources are there? You know, the internet is a good resource, but as I think we were saying earlier, it's sort of like, you know, it's a bit of a wild west out there, and you sort of like, you might type in bisexual and then you get some pornographic site. I'm not saying there's anything wrong about pornographic sites, but it might not be what you were sort of like trying to look for. And, you know, so that's a problem. We need a bit more, you know, bi visibility in television and culture, basically, as well. The more normalised things, and this happens as well with trans issues, etc. You know, when a trans person on the television is a novelty, etc., then assumptions are made, and there's still that sort of like prejudice. But as soon as the person becomes, there's many trans people on television, I really like that actress or that actor who happens to be trans, or that role, that character, etc., then it becomes almost every day, which it is. Let's face it, it is every day, but our media doesn't often reflect that. So I think that's an important aspect, and prides are as well.
Yeah, well, thank you so much for coming on and chatting to us at Pride Matters. It's been great to talk to you and get to hear what you've got to say.
Great. Well, good luck to everyone, and let's hope we get out of lockdown by next Pride season. So,
well, we'll see.
Heather, I know you talked about the BiCon conference. If people wanted to get involved in that, if people wanted to find out more information, is there somewhere that they can go to find out about the projects and workshops that you talked about?
Basically, just describing it's BiCon, BiCon, and then sort of like 2020, for example, will take you to this year's site, and then there'll be links to what's happening next year, or we hope is happening next year. So I would really recommend it. And it's really really good, and we're learning our lessons, because we've always had underrepresentation from minorities within minorities, etc. And it's getting a lot better, and we're making sure that we're trying to advertise out there and train ourselves. So people do join up.
Thank you so much for tuning in to Pride Matters. If you'd like to be involved in the next episode, tweet us with the hashtag Pride Matters Podcast with a topic or question, and we'll get answering it next time.
So that's all we have time for in today's episode. But we're back every month. It's the third Thursday of each month on YouTube, Spotify, Apple, your favourite podcast platform and service. So drop us a comment or leave us a review, let us know what you think, and we'll get back to you on that. So thank you so much again for tuning in. Until next time.